My name is Abdul Rahman AlAgeli. I am the Security File Coordinator in the Decision Support Office in the Office of the Prime Minister and Rapporteur of the Supreme Committee on Border Affairs. Today I would like to speak very briefly on what is called DDR and security sector reform in Libya in a mainly general and descriptive format in order to leave enough time for a substantive discussion and question and answer session. I would like you to think about this issue outside the sometimes constricting box of theoretical framework. Rather, I would like to discuss these issues based on a rational and common sense analysis of the current situation and its causes and underlying motivations from somebody who is experiencing it day to day on the ground. Thus far, not many people have looked at this issue in a holistic fashion in order to provide a holistic response, and I feel we could do so and have a responsibility to do so. This speech may create more questions than it brings answers, but I hope we will be able to have a substantive discussion afterwards. It is useful to look at Libya as a series of voids either being filled or waiting to be filled, mostly by those who don't have that responsibility and happen to be in the right place at the right time. I'd like you to think about security as a result rather than an end and a means in of itself. In other words, in Libya, most security issues cannot be solved purely by security solutions. Rather, most issues can be solved with socio-economic and political solutions. I will expand on this later in the talk. Public trust in the government's ability to provide public services, including security, has all but eroded. If you think about it practically, people are having to provide their own security either by owning a weapon or creating their own connection or links with state actors or militias. After 2 years of unreliable electricity services, many now own generators. After recent water cuts, those who can have invested in a well to provide their own water in case of a cut-off. The state of healthcare in Libya has also meant that most citizens seek to get treatment abroad, even primary healthcare in countries like Tunisia. More and more people are even turning to satellite internet connections rather than the state-owned providers because of the abysmal quality of internet services in Libya, which I've had to wrestle with in participating in this conference. This and many more examples are an indication of a drowning government that some suggest, with the current budget pressures from the oil and gas infrastructure takeovers, is on the brink of either collapse or complete inertia. People, however, will find ways of filling the voids left by the government in ways that are mostly destructive in the long term. We have identified 4 immediate national security priorities, and they're all based on a rescue from collapse. The first is protection of territorial integrity, then protection of socio-economic stability, the protection of basic services and critical infrastructure, and lastly, the protection of civilians and civilian institutions. Let's begin by defining some of the terms that we'll be using. I agree in principle with Small Arms Survey's definitions of the stakeholders, whereby they have defined it as state, quasi-state and non-state. State actors, you could say, include the formal security apparatus such as the National Armed Forces, the police and intelligence services, all of which are operating at a fraction of their previous capacity. Quasi-state actors include revolutionary brigades, both regulated and unregulated. These brigades were formed organically during the 2011 revolution and enjoy strong community linkages, local support, combat and weapons experience, direct links and support from local civilian and military institutions such as local military councils, and more importantly, strength in numbers, although the numbers are not as inflated as claimed and would barely reach 40,000. Also under quasi-state actors are post-revolutionary brigades formed mainly after the liberation of the capital on August the 20th, 2011. They were formed to fill a security vacuum left by the former security services and also to augment revolutionary brigades. Many groups have tried to organize the brigades under various banners, organizations and unions post-revolution, the most high profiles of which are the Supreme Security Committee under the Ministry of Interior and the Libya Shield under the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. However, it's important to stress that although these forces receive salaries from the formal agencies or ministries, it does not necessarily mean that they are under complete control, can be completely accounted for, or follow direct orders from officials. Non-state actors include militias or any group that isn't covered by the previous section, including armed criminal groups and ideologically orientated armed groups and extremists. These groups pose a significant threat to the state, as the state and quasi-state actors don't have the necessary capacity to monitor and eliminate the threat posed from these groups. Since 2011, the Libyan authorities have not demonstrated any tangible vision on DDR, and the steps taken by the responsible agencies have been ineffective, ill thought out and disorganized. So-called DDR activities over the past 2 years have actually been destructive in the long term and have contributed to the retrenchment of the stakeholders and the fragmentation of security apparatus, state and quasi-state. Current thinking on dealing with what some call militias is split into a group that suggests that they are the only hope of providing security for the next few years until the formal security services are up and running. Others that suggest that disarmament is the first step, and some that suggest that disarmament is a result of reintegration or integration. Some that agree also that the general level of security has an effect on the willingness of ex-combatants to disarm, the paradox being that in most cases they are the cause of the problem and sometimes the cure. International efforts to engage in and support disarmament activities have historically proven to be ineffective, and there is no expectation that the Libyan case will not adhere to lessons learned over the past 10 to 15 years. The principal exception being where international actors were authorized to undertake coercive disarmament efforts, for example the Australians in the Solomon Islands and Timor-Leste. However, the coercive successes of disarmament are not transferable to Libya. The ineffectiveness of other programs can be very instructive. Many of the current projects on this matter in Libya are actually RDD programs, whereby a combatant is reintegrated into civilian life or integrated into security services, and following that, or as the result of that, he would be disarmed and demobilized. One of the reasons this has been ineffective is not only because the conditions were insecure and this increased the motivation to be armed, it is more because the state of the institutions, public or private, were incapable of absorbing or managing the reintegrated combatants. For example, you have a weak and distorted private sector which is monopolized and oligopolized by state-owned companies and institutions. And also you have an inefficient and distorted public sector, security and non-security institutions, and poor educational institutions. The administrative and human resource management capabilities of the government and the state security apparatus plays a significant role in the inability to absorb and effectively manage state and quasi-state forces, whereby this administrative and human resource management capacity is abysmally poor. What you actually find in most cases is that there is nowhere that has the capacity to employ these combatants or youth into real productive functions. So even if they were demobilized and disarmed, the conditions that lead to discontent, frustration and desperation are still present. For example, unemployment, no opportunities. And it was these conditions built up over a number of years that led to the 2011 revolution. What the state would effectively be saying is that youth should give up their guns or become tools for the old generation, effectively losing their only bargaining power with the vested interest. This is a very important point, because the weapon is then represents not a weapon to be used to effect harm. It actually represents status and a bargaining tool. In essence, if they were to agree, which they will not, the state is saying now it's time for the state security services to take control and to enforce the rule of law coercively, while at the same time the state does not have the incentives. Well, I need to specify, the Libyan state does not have the incentives to provide the real reforms or guarantees that would A, limit its power, and B, create the type of society that people feel that they fought for. And the real bargaining power is lost, which in any case would lead to unrest, and weapons are and will continue to be easy to come by, so forces can then be rearmed and remobilized immediately and would retrench, having lost complete trust in the government. This would be a much more dangerous position. What I'm trying to say is that security is not the only reason that there are armed groups in Libya. There are political motivations also, mainly of a self-empowerment nature. And it is essential to analyze this. The idea that the very nature of the armed struggle has created what you may call new men that are no longer willing to be passive, but are instead seeking further empowerment. This is evident in the politicized brigades, such as the Qaqa Brigade, which have a direct link to the National Forces Alliance, and the regional militarized brigades, such as brigades from Misrata and from Zintan, for example, rather than armed youth or armed groups in general. Further to that, when linked to what is called the Libyan mentality. Now, at this stage in the speech, I will begin to speak more about the underlying causes of some of the behaviors that are causing destruction in the public and private sector. So when we link this situation to what is called the Libyan mentality, which symptoms include a general sense of entitlement to the country's wealth, leading to the rentier state mentality, which distorts A, the incentives to be productive in public functions, B, it distorts the incentives to create transparent and accountable institutions, C, it causes the privatization of public functions to personal, family, network benefits rather than the public interest, and D, a lack of clarity and ownership rights. This has led to an informal and destructive method of satisfying one's sense of entitlement, represented in such examples as one receiving public sector salaries with no responsibility to be productive in return. An example of this is the fact that we have an estimated over 2 million people receiving salaries from the public sector, which is a huge proportion of our labor force. If one were to analyze how many of those people are actually productive or active in their public sector job, you would probably find that less than 5% or 10% are actually active, and the rest are receiving salaries without any active productivity. There is also the corruption, the taking over of oil fields, for example. These are all examples of the satisfaction of the average Libyan's sense of entitlement. And more importantly, it creates the situation where the performance of state functions is being done by private individuals and groups. This includes security. As I mentioned earlier, not many people have looked at this issue in a holistic fashion in order to provide a holistic response. A holistic response would be a complete structural and economic reform, and a vision to minimize the rentier state symptoms, possibly by changing the mechanisms by which the country's wealth is distributed and, more importantly, owned, in inverted commas. With the short-term response being an immediate and sustained effort to improve governance and security sector governance specifically. There are many ways of meeting this objective, and there have been a series of conferences, seminars, training packages done by the Libyan government alongside the international community on security sector reform, the most high profile of which are the London and Paris meetings, which suggested new mechanisms of managing national security sector priorities, which I'm happy to speak about during the discussion if anybody would like me to. The concept of improving inter- and intra-ministerial coordination and integration of government activities on all issues, including national security, is absolutely crucial. The absence of this has created many of the failures we are currently seeing and makes the government incapable of even completing the simplest objective. The main issue is that until now, I feel that the efforts of security sector reform by the Libyan government have not been sincere and sustained. So there is no continuity in efforts. And many of the international community that we deal with will tell you the same thing. Now, without going any further, I will now end the speech, and I would now like to open the floor for the discussion. Thank you for listening, and I hope the speech was of some benefit. Thank you very much.